What are your thoughts on the FAO's long shadow report that states livestock farming is responsible for only 14.5% of greenhouse gas emissions?
The most recent United Nations figures put livestock as producing just 14.5% of global emissions. That's technically correct, but it's misleading. The reason for that is that agriculture, livestock in particular, produce a lot of short-term gases. Methane is the largest of those gases. It lasts only 10 years in the atmosphere, but the United Nations Convention averages its effect over 100 years. It's like buying a car, paying it off over 100 years, but the car only lasts for 10 years. It's technically correct, but quite misleading. Methane is a powerful gas for transformative action on climate change. Because it lasts only 10 years in the atmosphere and is gone after 10 years, we can use that to reduce that gas. Will have an immediate impact on climate change. If we stop CO2 tomorrow, it will be thousands of years before the effect really reduces, whereas methane and the short-term gases will reduce almost immediately. So the answer to, in the short term, you see, coming decades are critical to stop this climate crisis. So the answer to that is the short-term gases, livestock in particular.
There seems to be a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that the livestock industry has too much influence over policy making. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, livestock industries definitely have a lot of influence in government and also in universities and research to do with livestock. I was principal scientist with natural resources in Queensland, Australia, and several of my colleagues left to go into the private sector, the animal industries, and they came back. Some of them came back through that revolving door. The links between government and research and animal agriculture, industry bodies are very strong, and their influence is pervasive.
Could you please comment on how the livestock industry influences scientific data to suit industry financial interests?
Yes, industry bodies, livestock industry bodies and research organisations and governments are very close. I was principal scientist in Queensland, Australia with natural resources, and several of my colleagues left to join industry bodies to help them with their research, and then some of them came back through that revolving door. There are close ties between the research organisations and governments and government policy and industry. It's very pervasive because livestock industries depend on government policies that support them. Yeah, livestock interests and bodies are very close to government. And this comes from the days when government departments of primary industry or agriculture existed to support agriculture. So they felt that whatever benefited agriculture was good for government. And therefore the attitude is, in fact, governments have policies that support so-called high-value agriculture, meat and dairy. And government policy in that regard is not for the benefit of the land. It's not for the benefit of the future of the landscape. It's for the benefit of the industry. The livestock industry, by the way, were funding some of the research that we did. In fact, I left government as a result of my staff, among others, working on a report for industry that showed that it was a greenwash of the Queensland beef industry. And it showed that the methane from the cattle was offset by them not clearing so many trees. So the influence that the Meat and Livestock Australia had on on government was pervasive, and it's at all levels. It's at all policy levels in industry. Another really good example of how agricultural animal industries influence government is the Great Barrier Reef. Now, each year, a lot of science goes into looking at the health of the Great Barrier Reef, and it's common knowledge now that the biggest killer, or one of the biggest killers, is the fine sediment, the sediment that stays in solution once it's left the river mouth. The catchments, the river catchments that empty out into the Great Barrier Reef, the Fitzroy and the Burdekin rivers, have been subject to an enormous amount of deforestation in the last 10 years. And we know from the measurements that 70% of the fine sediment, of the 70% of that reef killer sediment, comes from grazing land. Now, that is kept out of the public consciousness. We're more interested in the dredging for new coal terminals, for example, which have a minor effect compared with the sediment that's released every day from those big rivers. That sediment kills the reef, but you never hear about that. You never hear that animal grazing, beef production in Queensland is killing the Great Barrier Reef. We don't hear that.
What are the issues surrounding animal agriculture and water use?
Yes, water is a global emergency. The Syrian refugee crisis and now the African, sub-Saharan African countries, it's a real crisis for water. The Syrian refugees had their roots in the millennium drought in the Middle East. And if you're a farmer and your crops have failed for the 5th, 6th, 7th year in a row, and you've got nothing to eat, what do? You up and you walk. So climate refugees or water refugees are the face of climate change. So water is such a critical thing, both for climate and for security, that the US military see it as a risk multiplier. They see it as one of the biggest risks for the future for climate change, the security issues around water. It's well known that animal products require many times more water than plant products, up to 100 times more water than plant products. So if we eat less meat and dairy, we're eating less water, in effect. In 2012, the Stockholm International Water Institute produced a report that looked at that. It looked at the connection between what we eat and the water that we eat. And their conclusion was that unless we reduce the amount of animal products that we eat, by 2050, we need to reduce our consumption of meat globally by 3/4, 75%, so that the global diet that will provide enough fresh water for the world will be one where just 5% of our calories come from meat products and meat and dairy. Reducing our meat and dairy consumption to just 5% of our intake is a huge reduction for anyone on the Western diet, but globally it's a big reduction. So if we want enough fresh water for future generations, water alone dictates that we must change our diet away from meat and dairy.
What's the relationship between land use for livestock production and deforestation?
Deforestation is one area where we are rapidly approaching a planetary boundary. We're in that uncertain zone, but we're nearing a planetary boundary. In fact, there was a study last year by a number of Australians and others that reported that within 10 to 15 years, we will be reaching a point where we have overstepped that boundary. And the logical result of the forest destruction that's going on right now will be ecological collapse. In my own experience, that was my area of expertise. My team worked on monitoring, mapping deforestation across the state of Queensland. It's a global hotspot, continues to be, but we used to go out and crawl all over the countryside and use satellite images to map deforestation. The scale of the forest destruction just in my corner of the world was staggering. About 10 square kilometres per day, that's about 4 square miles per day of forest was being cleared just for beef and sheep production. We're only one small corner of the world. 13 million, globally, 13 million hectares a year is being cleared around the world. The scale of this is enormous, particularly in the tropics. Today, tropical deforestation is the hotspot. Most of that is for agriculture. A good example of deforestation is China. China are actually patting themselves on the back because they are increasing their amount of forests in their own country. However, China is now the biggest importer of grain, particularly to feed its pigs. China's appetite for pork is immense, and they're the world's biggest importer of grain. The world's biggest exporters of grain are South America. Brazil is the major one. And so China is actually increasing its own forest, but it is having a huge impact on South America's forest through the feed for its appetite for pork. Deforestation for livestock is an area it's really hard to pin down. And it's an area where we have a lot of arguments, but it's quite simple. It's well known now that in the Brazilian rainforest, that clearing is now used for... The soils in a rainforest are not very fertile. So when you clear these areas, the best thing you can do is graze animals. They're not very suitable for growing crops. For a few years they are, but not after that. So what happens in tropical deforestation, in the Amazon at least, is that the resulting land use is for livestock. Now, there's a really interesting thing about deforestation. Most people think that logging kills forests. That's not true. If you log a forest, even clear felling a forest, if you then leave it alone, it will regrow as forest. Forests are actually hard to kill. So the tool that's used universally is fire. So the burning of the forests after they've been cut down is the thing that they do year after year to kill a forest. And you look at the fires in the Amazon, you look at the fires in Indonesia, the world's second hotspot. These fires are choking the region, and it's all because they want to change the land use from forest. Fire is the killer of forest, not logging. So if you look at why do they use fire, it's for land use. Even in Australia, 500,000 square kilometres of the northern Australia is burned every year just to kill off the old dead grass and to stop the forests advancing onto grazing lands. It's just for pasture management for livestock. So deforestation and the resulting land use is the critical thing. Connected with deforestation is land use. Now, it's a really interesting topic, how we use our planet. So if you take just the parts of our planet that people use, if you exclude the ice caps, the snow areas, if you exclude the deserts, if you exclude the water, just the land that we use, about a third of it is still forest, thank God. Most of it's degraded forest, but say a third is still forest. And if you exclude that, what you're left with is the parts that humanity uses. Now, 3% of that land, just 3%, is all the built-up areas. So that's cities, transport, infrastructure, mining as well. The rest of it, about a quarter, is used for crops. Now, half of those crops, roughly, are used for humanity as food, and about half of those crops are used to feed livestock. So what's left is grazing areas, okay? What's left is almost 75% of the land that we use. So fully 3/4 of our world is devoted to livestock, grazing, that is. Now, what is that? It's red meat. Effectively, it's beef and it's sheep, goats maybe, but it's red meat. So the powerful control that we have on what will influence the land on our planet more than anything else is red meat. And of course, half of the crops which are fed to other livestock. So that's a powerful tool. We think that we must have animal agriculture, therefore that land use called grazing is set in stone. It's not. We can change grazing, we can change the land use of 3/4 of our used planet tomorrow just by moving away from red meat. And that's a powerful thing for the landscape, powerful thing for the climate to soak up emissions. In fact, Africa is a prime example of that. In sub-Saharan Africa, a study was done in 2010 that showed that half of that land, which is high rainfall savanna, in other words, it's a high rainfall, high enough for it to be a forest, but it's savanna now, and it's savanna because it's burnt every year. The NASA produces fire maps every 10 days of global fire maps. And if you look at 10-year segments, you see that the world is burning. And it's burning to produce grazing areas for livestock. And Africa is a classic example of that. If we just stop the burning, 50% of sub-Saharan Africa would revert from savanna to forest. That would soak up an enormous amount of carbon dioxide, and it would do an enormous thing for biodiversity loss, which is also a planetary boundary that we have overstepped. If we want to look at what is the cause of deforestation, we've got to look at the land use following the deforestation. Now, most of the deforestation globally has been for agriculture. It's the land that we use for our food now. But if you look at the current tropical deforestation, which is a planetary boundary we're very close to overstepping, animal agriculture is the big one. In the north of South America, in Brazil, in the tropics, you've got livestock. In the south, in the subtropics, you've got the Cerrado, which is the big hotspot of today, where they're using a method that was invented in Australia to clear forests, 2 enormous bulldozers connected with a chain, and they go flat out, side by side, until they just pull down the forest, and they push it together and burn it. They don't even use the timber. But that's a hotspot for soy production and maize production, all for livestock. 95% of the world's soy is used to feed animals. And soy at the moment is the big area of expansion, agricultural expansion in Brazil and other South American countries. And China is the big market. China used to be a small consumer of meat, but now they've almost reached the levels where the West is. In fact, the Chinese government is concerned over its use, over the level of consumption of meat, so much so that a couple of years ago they employed Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Cameron to be the face of a campaign to reduce meat consumption by half. That's a voluntary campaign at the moment, but government is behind that. So they can see the problems caused by food is globally affecting our planet.
And how about the relationship between biodiversity loss and animal agriculture?
Yes. Biodiversity loss is one of the two planetary boundaries that we have most overstepped. It comes as a surprise to most people to hear that we right now are in the middle of the sixth great extinction. We know that there's been 5 other extinctions on planet Earth. The worst of those killed off 95% of life on Earth. Right now, we are in a planetary extinction event that threatens this same level of extinction. The background rates of loss of species are 1,000 to 10,000 times more than it used to be. So biodiversity loss is a critical point for humanity, and because we've overstepped this planetary boundary, the experts are saying that if we overstep this boundary, it threatens all life on Earth. What creates life and sustains life on Earth is the web of life. You all know the importance of bees, for example, for crops, but for biodiversity, it does matter if a species goes extinct. And extinctions are not the big indicator. It's actually loss of communities. We might have a few, Sumatran tigers left, for example, but it's the loss of that community that has killed that ecology. They are no longer the apex predator. In other words, it keeps the whole lot in control. So the loss of one species is not the important thing. It's the loss of communities, and that's happening globally. Since 1970, the world has lost 58% of its wildlife. Vertebrates, we're wiping them out. In the oceans, we've lost 80 to 90% of the big fish. We are now the apex predator. The biodiversity and the sixth great extinction threatens all life on Earth. Many science publications have addressed biodiversity, but the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency in 2010 put out a report that looked at why is biodiversity loss happening, why are species going extinct and losing communities, and what can be done about it. And they looked at a range of measures, and they found that the most effective thing that humanity can do to stop species loss is a no-meat diet. They even looked at doubling the size of the world's parks and reserves, and found that that didn't have anywhere near the impact of the no-meat diet. The no-meat diet frees up 3/4 of our used world, frees up all the grazing land of the planet to revert to habitat. And this, of course, provides home for species. Biodiversity loss happens because of loss and fragmentation of habitat. So the biggest threat to that is agriculture, livestock agriculture. And the best thing we can do to stop that is to revert those lands back to habitat.
What is the importance of biodiversity to our own survival?
Biodiversity, the planetary boundary to do with biodiversity, is one that's considered to be most overstepped. In other words, biodiversity loss now, the sixth great extinction, is threatening all life on Earth. Some have predicted that by 2045, the species loss levels will be so great that we won't recover. The Earth will suffer ecological collapse. The web of life will not sustain life on Earth any longer. So the future for humanity, as well as all those other species on Earth, depends on the web of life. The web of life is biodiversity, and biodiversity's loss is a bit of a nebulous thing to most people, but it sustains life on Earth. If we kill off too many of our fellow species, all of us won't survive. Biodiversity loss is critical to life on Earth. And the biggest thing you and I can do is change our diet. The term biodiversity loss is a bit nebulous to a lot of people, but what it means is species dying out. If we reach a point where we lose enough species on Earth, we will suffer ecological collapse. Since 1970, we've lost nearly 60% of the vertebrates, of the animals on planet Earth. We've killed them out, largely because of agricultural production. So it's been predicted that by 2045, we could see a tipping point where the biodiversity loss or loss of communities, loss of species will accelerate. And we will be one of them. Humanity may well die out with the other species. The web of life sustains us all. If we reach a tipping point and we continue to lose species, this is a threat to humanity as well as those species. This is not called the sixth great extinction by many scientists lightly. In fact, the terminology now used even in science papers is alarmist. They are saying that unless we do something now, time is critical. We must act. And the biggest thing we can do is return the land to be habitat. This will support our life, not just their life.
Could the adoption of a vegan diet globally save the planet and buy us more time?
So the impact of a plant-based diet on humanity, will it save the planet? Yes. But let's bring that back to a more human scale. Let's imagine, for example, that you and your growing family were living together on an island. Now, this island were to support you and your grandkids and their grandkids, so you had to live within the island's resources. Now, what threatens life on your island, if you look at the global picture, but let's bring it back to your family. The two things that threaten your future, are biodiversity loss, the loss of species. You've wiped out 60% of the wildlife on your island. You've wiped out 80 to 90% of the fish in your oceans. That's the biggest thing that threatens you. The second biggest thing that threatens you right now is an issue that many people have never heard of, and that is nitrogen pollution. So the nitrogen that you're putting on your crops, that you're producing from your piggeries, from your chook production, chickens production, from your fish farms, that nitrogen is killing off your rivers, your waterways, and it's producing dead zones in your ocean. Okay, this is your little island, right? So think about these are your two biggest problems. The next biggest problems you have is that you're killing your forests to the rate where ecological collapse is only a decade or so away. So you're destroying forests way too quickly. And the other thing that's threatening life on your little island is climate change. You've had your own crop failures, you're suffering extreme weather events, you're suffering droughts. When it rains, it pours. And you've got your neighbouring island getting in their boats and coming over to your island because their crops have failed 1 year too many. So you're seeing climate refugees. So you're, as head of the family, if you're trying to protect your family and its future on this island, you're in dire straits. You've got to do something about this. So what do you do? Well, if you look at the proportions of the land on your island, just a small percent is built up, 2 or 3%. A quarter of your land is devoted to crops, half the crops for your livestock, half the crops to eat. But 3/4 of your island, excluding the bits that you don't use, is grazing. Okay, so this is a powerful tool. This is an enormous area of your land. What do you do with it? That 3/4 of your land is devoted to red meat, cattle, sheep, goats. So you call a meeting of your family, clan, the decision makers in your clan, and you're thinking about the future. What about our grandkids? What can we do? And someone says, okay, let's stop red meat. And then we can take that land, that 3/4 of our used land, and we can turn it back to forest. Immediately, that stops your threatening ecological collapse of your forests, and it produces habitat for wildlife, again, once more. 3/4 of your land, that's a huge area of your land that you can then turn back to habitat. So that 60% of your animals, wildlife that you've killed off will start to repopulate. So yes, we can solve the extinction crisis in one move. It also solves a lot of water problems, etc. Now, what else can we do to solve our problems? We've still got this nitrogen pollution issue. How can we best solve that? Okay, well, nitrogen is a really interesting story, but at its most basic level, nitrogen equals protein. And if we eat at the top of the food chain, if we eat beef, for example, 95% of the nitrogen that goes into producing that steak is lost as waste. 4% ends up in our bodies. So 96% is waste. And that nitrogen pollution, it's smaller for pigs and for chickens, etc., and for fish, but it's still pervasive. It's killing off our waterways and our oceans. In fact, it's been predicted that if we don't make big changes, if we don't reduce our nitrogen consumption by half globally, we're going to have toxic rivers, lifeless waterways, and dead oceans. So this is a risk for your island. What are you going to do about it? Well, your piggeries produce a lot of nitrogen, your chicken operations and your fish farms, enormous amount of nitrogen. If we stop eating those things, that will immediately solve the crisis. And the experts tell us, by the way, that that will more than halve our nitrogen intake. So we've solved our nitrogen problem overnight. The other issue is climate change. Okay, what can we do about that? Well, by taking red meat and your other livestock off the menu, you've reduced all those nitrous oxide and methane problems, and the effect of that will be enormous. In fact, just by stopping methane production from livestock, will buy you time. It's such a short-lived gas. It's only there for 10 years. So if we stop that production, you will feel the results tomorrow. In fact, if we stop the methane from livestock, we will buy ourselves 25 years to do something about CO2, about fossil fuel emissions. So this is what you can do on your little island. You can halt climate change by reducing the methane. By growing the trees, by reverting your pastures back to forests, you can also soak up 10 years of fossil fuel emissions. So you've just bought yourself about 35 years to deal with the larger energy issues of carbon dioxide. So you're solving your climate change problem, you're solving your nitrogen pollution, your deforestation, and your biodiversity crisis. So thinking about your family, about your island that you live on, the future of your island, the future of your growing family, their grandkids and your grandkids forever, the most effective thing that you can do is to change your diet to a plant-based diet.
Can you talk about nitrous oxide?
Livestock produce a range of greenhouse gases. The most important is methane from mostly ruminant animals, but also livestock manure produce a range of greenhouse gases as well, nitrous oxide and methane amongst them. It's interesting that livestock on Earth now is double the weight, the live weight, if you like, of humanity. And in most countries, human waste is treated. We process it so it's okay to send it out to the environment. If you can imagine twice the live weight of humanity in livestock, none of that waste is treated. So that's all, in fact, it's concentrated in a lot of places at piggeries and chook production, fish farms. That nitrogen particularly, which is a huge pollutant, is concentrated so that it then muddies the downstream waterways and produces toxic rivers, lifeless oceans. So nitrous oxide is a powerful pollutant as well as greenhouse gas, along with methane.
So livestock consumes 50% of the world's grain, 80% of the world's soy, but produces only 13% of the world's calories. Is this an efficient food system?
The way we eat animals that eat grain is a very wasteful system. Were we to change to a plant-based diet, we would free up all of the resources, all of the crops that now go to animals, so that we wouldn't actually need as much cropland to feed humanity. What happens when we feed livestock is that livestock take about half of the world's grain, most of the soy, most of the maize, corn, but they provide just 13% of our calories, extremely low. So the rest is waste, mostly nitrogen waste, which is the biggest pollution threat we face. So if humanity wants to support more people on planet Earth, we don't have a population problem with people, we have a livestock population problem. Each year now we breed close to 70 billion animals. Most of them are chickens. But if you can imagine the Western diet, take for example the North American diet, each year that means that every individual eats about 25 animals. And those are something like 1.5 cows, a pig and a bit, various other livestock, but most of them are chickens. So you have an entourage. If you're the average eater, you have an entourage of around 25 animals that you eat throughout the year. And if you can imagine a family of 4 with 100 animals, you're not just feeding a family of 4, you're feeding 100 animals. So that is a very wasteful process. It's a very messy process too, you can imagine. All the waste from those animals in your backyard. It's got to be a big backyard by now. But 100 animals for the average family, most people don't see that. It's hidden from them. The livestock that's produced today is done in a commercial fashion. It's done on an industrial scale. And most of that is hidden. There's even laws, that ag-gag laws, for example, that stop people seeing the effect of what they eat. We live in cities, so we don't see the enormous production of livestock behind the curtain. When I was working with the Natural Resources Department, we used to drive and look at deforestation. For sometimes we'd be driving for 10, 15, 20 minutes along a road, logging data of recent clearing that year. So this is trees, kilometres and kilometres and kilometres of trees that from one year to the next have been cleared. And in that case, it was for beef production. So the effect of the wastefulness of our diet, if we want to be more efficient, if we want to feed less mouths, we must go towards a plant-based diet.
Farm animals convert low biological value protein foods that are less palatable and less nutrient dense to high biological value foods that are highly palatable and nutrient dense. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, there is a growing movement among graziers, among livestock farmers, towards a thing that was popularised by Alan Savory called the holistic grazing. It's also now known as regenerative farming. And they're looking at ways of improving soil carbon as a means of offsetting the emissions from livestock. And the theory goes that if you put more livestock on a given amount of land, you actually improve the soil so that you're offsetting those emissions. This is great to support extra soil carbon. However, it's fanciful. Sure, you can improve soil carbon for a few years, but the soil carbon that you can, on a grazing operation, the soil carbon that you can improve is a small fraction of the emissions of the livestock. Methane is a particularly nasty gas. There's a group out of Oxford Uni called the Food Climate Research Network, and they've in early 2018, they produced a report that it's called Grazed and Confused, but it looks at the different methods of grazing production and the emissions from those. And it's summarising a number of other reports, but you can either improve your production from a pasture or you can improve soil carbon, but you can't do both. In the short term, you can improve soil carbon, but in the longer term, you can't keep on improving it and increase production. It just doesn't work.